Little slave girl spots wrong wax color on freedom papers. Her perfect memory exposes the fraud that shocked the county. A child with a faded blue ribbon stands in the plantation yard as dawn breaks over Mississippi bottomland. The young heir reads manumission papers by lantern light, freeing every soul, then asks one woman to marry him when the law calls her free. But the overseer slams down a ledger, claiming $50 in debt, waving a red-sealed pass that chains her to bondage. The little girl steps closer to the barrel, her dark eyes studying the wax. "That color ain't ours," she whispers, and the crowd goes silent. Storm clouds gather as patrollers ride through rising floodwater, chasing boats through cypress swamps, while hymns map out hidden crossing routes. Church bells ring through the rain as 14 couples wait to be married, but forged documents could destroy them all. Can a child's perfect memory prove the fraud before the law dogs find their trail, or will one wrong seal doom every soul seeking freedom to a lifetime in chains? The kitchen yard smelled of wet earth and cold ash. Dawn crept grey over the Mississippi bottomland, and steam rose from the washpots like ghosts. The young heir stood beside a flour barrel, his coat collar turned up against the chill, a leather packet clutched in his fever-pale hands. From the quarters came a low hum, a hymn, threading through the morning air, soft as smoke. The heir coughed, a sharp sound that made the sparrows scatter from the porch eaves. He pulled a lantern from his wagon and set it on the barrel. The flame licked yellow against the grey light. "Everyone come," he called. His voice cracked like a boy's, though he was near 25. "Everyone who lives on this land." Doors opened. Bare feet whispered across dirt yards. The overseer, Duggan, emerged from the big house adjusting his hat brim, his mouth already set in a scowl. Field hands gathered in a half-circle. Women carried babies on their hips. Children pressed close to their mothers' skirts. The bride-to-be, though none yet knew that word applied, stepped from the kitchen house, flour still dusty on her brown hands. Her little sister, barely 10, slipped beside her like a shadow. The child wore a faded blue ribbon at her throat, and her eyes held the still watchfulness of deep water. "I got papers here," the heir said. He broke the wax seal with shaking fingers. "Legal papers, signed and sworn." The preacher moved closer, a tall man with silver threading his beard. He began to hum under his breath the same tune that had been rising from the quarters. "My daddy's dead these 3 weeks," the heir continued, "and I come to do what should have been done long since." He lifted the first paper toward the lantern light. "I free every soul on this land, every man, woman, child, free by law and by right." A gasp ran through the crowd. Babies startled and began to cry. The little girl stepped forward, her dark eyes fixed on the heir's face. "Papers is here for all," he said, his voice gathering strength. "Manumission papers, witnessed and sealed." He set the documents on the barrel beside the lantern. The flame made the official seals glow like drops of blood. Then he did something that made the county talk for years after. He looked straight at the woman with flour on her hands, looked at her as if they were alone on that plot of earth, and spoke the words that would echo through courthouse halls and church pews alike. "I free every soul on this land," he said again, louder now. "And I ask only one thing of one person." He stepped closer to her, close enough that she could see the fever bright in his eyes. "Sarah, will you marry me when the law calls you free?" The silence stretched like a held breath. Then voices broke loose, gasps, murmurs, a few soft amens from the older women. Sarah's hand flew to her throat. The little girl's ribbon fluttered as if a breeze had caught it. But before Sarah could speak, before anyone could speak, Duggan pushed through the crowd. "Hold on there." His voice cut through the moment like an axe through green wood. "Hold on just 1 minute." He pulled a ledger from under his arm, thick and bound in cracked leather. "There's accounts to settle first. Debts outstanding." The heir's face went pale as winter sky. "What debts?" "Advance debt," Duggan said, flipping pages. "Cloth and such, tonics from town." His finger traced a line of figures. "Sarah here, she owes near $50 for sundries I fronted her these past months." Sarah shook her head. "I never, and there's this." Duggan pulled a folded paper from his vest pocket. The wax seal caught the lantern light red as fresh blood. "Travel pass. Shows she went to Natchez on credit last spring. Hour's passage and lodging both." The little girl moved closer to the barrel. Her breath made small clouds in the cold air as she studied the paper Duggan held. The preacher's humming stopped. "Duggan, you saying the girl can't be freed?" "I'm saying debt's got to clear first. That's law." Duggan's smile showed teeth. "Probate clerk won't enter no manumission till all accounts balance." The heir reached for the paper, but Duggan held it back. "You want to see it? Take it to town." Let the clerk read the seal. The little girl's ribbon touched the edge of the barrel as she leaned forward. Her voice, when she spoke, was soft as moth wings. "That seal ain't right." Every face turned toward her. Duggan's eyebrows drew together. "What you say, girl?" She pointed at the paper. "The wax. That ain't our county's color." The overseer laughed, but it sounded forced. "Child don't know what she's talking about. Clerk's seal is clerk's seal." But the preacher stepped closer, squinting at the red wax in the lantern light. The little girl touched her ribbon to her lips, then pointed again. "Our clerk uses black wax," she said. "Always black, and them letters." She tilted her head, listening to something only she could hear. "They's backwards in the press." Duggan's face darkened. "You calling me a liar, girl?" The heir looked from the paper to the child, fever making his eyes too bright. "How do you know about the clerk's seal?" "I pay attention," the little girl said simply. "I remember things." The lantern flame licked higher as the overseer's pass met the barrel beside the marriage ask. Before the flame could sink, the little girl stepped closer to the seal. She reached out one small finger and touched the red wax. It flaked slightly under her fingertip, too dry, too old. "This color ain't ours," she said again, her voice carrying clear in the cold air. The overseer snatched the paper back. "Enough foolishness. These are legal documents, signed and sealed proper." But doubt had crept into the circle like morning fog. The preacher cleared his throat. "Maybe we ought to take this to the probate office. Let the clerk himself have a look." "Fine by me," Duggan said, but his voice had lost its certainty. "But till debt's clear, ain't nobody getting freed." The heir coughed again, harder this time. His hand shook as he reached for Sarah, then dropped to his side. "We'll go to town." First light. At first light, mule hooves drummed toward the probate office. The wagon jolted over ruts, still soft from yesterday's rain. The heir held the reins with one hand, pressed the other to his chest where the cough lived like a trapped bird. Beside him sat Sarah, her flour-dusted apron replaced by a clean brown dress. The little girl perched in the wagon bed, her ribbon bright against her dark skin. The preacher rode alongside on his old mare, close enough to keep watch over the heir's fevered face. Behind them, Duggan followed on his bay gelding, the disputed ledger tied behind his saddle. "You feeling poorly?" Sarah said to the heir. Not quite a question. He tried to smile. "I'll live to see you free. That's what matters." The little girl spoke from the wagon bed. "That pass paper, it ain't just the wrong color. The letters is turned around." The preacher slowed his mare to match the wagon's pace. "What letters, child?" She closed her eyes, and her lips moved silently. Then, "The clerk's name stamp should read J. Whitmore, probate. But in that seal, the J comes after Whitmore, like somebody pressed it backward." Sarah turned to stare at her sister. "How you know that?" "I seen the clerk's ring plenty times when Mama took us to town for market day." The child's voice went soft. "I remember the shape of things." The courthouse sat square and white at the end of Main Street, its columns thick as old trees. Wagons lined the hitching rail. Market day brought folks to town early. The heir tied off their mules and helped Sarah down. Her hand trembled in his. Inside, the probate office smelled of ink and old paper. A deputy clerk, younger than the regular man, sat behind a desk thick with ledgers and ribbon-tied documents. Red and black wax pots smoked on a warming plate beside his elbow. "Morning," the deputy said without looking up. "How can I serve you?" The heir set Sarah's manumission paper on the desk. "Need this recorded. Freedom paper for Sarah Clark, formerly property of deceased William Thornton." The deputy glanced at the document, then at Sarah. "She the property. She's the person being freed," the heir said, voice tight. "Well," the deputy dipped his pen. "Seems in order, but—" He looked past the heir to where Duggan stood in the doorway. "There's the matter of outstanding debt." Duggan stepped forward and placed his ledger on the desk with a solid thump. $50 in advances. Plus travel debt. He produced the disputed pass. "Can't free somebody who owes." The deputy studied the pass, holding it close to the window light. The little girl moved to the edge of the desk, her ribbon catching the morning sun that streamed through the glass. "This seal," the deputy began, then stopped. He looked at the pass again, then at the wax pot smoking beside his elbow, black and red, side by side. "Something wrong?" Duggan asked, but his voice had gone tight. The deputy set the pass down carefully. "Head clerk's out on circuit. Won't be back till Thursday. Can't process disputed papers without his review. Thursday's 4 days off," the heir said. "That's right." The deputy made a note in his daybook. "I'll schedule a public reading of accounts for then. Give everyone time to present their proofs." Duggan stepped closer to the desk. 4 days is a long time. Debt's got interest. Might need to call accounts earlier if creditors press." The little girl's eyes fixed on the deputy's face. He wore a ring on his right hand, silver, with a black stone. When he pressed it into the black wax to seal his note, the letters came out clear and true. J. Whitmore, probate. Not backwards, not red. The deputy flipped to the D page in his ledger, pen poised. "Name of debtor, Sarah Clark," Duggan said quickly. As the deputy wrote, the red wax pot smoked while shadows gathered in the courthouse corners. The little girl watched the clerk's ring, memorizing its shape, the way the letters pressed clean into black wax. Outside, storm clouds built like grey mountains on the horizon. That night, back at the quarters, a hymn rose to steady shaking hands. The sound drifted from the church house, a low, sweet melody that seemed to wrap itself around the cabins like a blanket. The little girl sat on the steps of the kitchen house, her ribbon loose in her fingers, listening. Sarah came out with a cup of willow bark tea, still steaming. "For his cough," she said, nodding toward the heir's room above the kitchen. "Fever's getting worse." The little girl took the cup, but didn't. Moved toward the stairs. "That hymn," she said. "It's the one Granny used to sing when the river was up." "What about it?" "She said it had a map in it, for when folks needed to cross water in the dark." Sarah sat beside her sister on the step. The hymn continued, voices joining and separating like water finding its course. "You remember everything, don't you? Some things stick better than others." The little girl turned the warm cup in her hands. "Like that seal today. Wrong color, wrong letters. You think Duggan made it up?" Before the little girl could answer, footsteps crunched across the yard. The preacher emerged from the darkness, his coat collar turned up against the night wind. "How's our young master?" he asked. "Poorly," Sarah said. "Won't let me send for the doctor." The preacher sat on the step below them. "Fever's bad." "Bad enough." Sarah's voice carried worry like a stone. "He keeps talking about papers. About getting things right." The hymn swelled from the church house, and the preacher's head tilted as he listened. "That's the old crossing song," he said softly. "Haven't heard that in years." The little girl leaned forward. "Granny said it told about ferry poles and fog banks. Safe places to cross when patrollers were riding. Your Granny was a wise woman." The preacher's eyes fixed on something distant. "Song's got more verses than most folks remember." "I remember them all," the little girl said simply. The preacher studied her face in the dim light spilling from the kitchen windows. "All of them." She nodded and began to hum. The melody was the same as the one drifting from the church house, but her version had more turns, more complicated passages that seemed to map out paths through darkness. "That verse there," the preacher said as she hummed, "the one about cypress knees and shallow water, you know what that means? Safe crossing when the river's up. 2 doors on the far side, one with a bell, one with a broken step." Sarah stared at her sister. "How do you know all that?" "Granny taught me before she died. Said songs carry things that papers can't." The little girl stood, teacup still warm in her hands. "I better take this up to him." She climbed the narrow stairs to the heir's room. He lay propped against pillows, his face flushed with fever, papers scattered across the quilt. "Sarah?" he said without opening his eyes. "It's me." Her sister. The little girl set the teacup on the bedside table. "Brought you something for the cough." He opened his eyes then, blinking until her face came clear. "The little one, with the ribbon?" "Yes, sir." He struggled to sit up, reaching for the tea. His hands shook as he drank. "That man, Duggan, you really think his papers are false?" The little girl perched on the edge of the straight-back chair. "I know they are." "How?" She was quiet for a moment, listening to the hymn that still drifted through the walls. Then, things got patterns. The way words look, the way wax sets, the way people's voices change when they're lying. Patterns don't lie. The heir drank more tea, and his breathing eased slightly. What pattern did you see today? Wrong color wax, letters pressed backward. And, she hesitated, what? The way he held that paper, like it might break if he wasn't careful. Old papers don't break that easy. The heir leaned back against his pillows. Outside, wind rattled the windows, and the first drops of rain tapped against the glass. If you're right, he said slowly, if those papers are false, then Sarah can be freed legal. We can be married, the little girl nodded. But we got to prove it. Got to show the clerk what's real and what ain't. Thunder rolled across the bottomland like a drum. The hymn from the church house rose to meet it, voices strong and sure in the growing storm. That song, the heir said, it sounds like a map. The little girl smiled for the first time since dawn. Everything's a map if you know how to read it. The next morning brought Dr. Hartwell in his black coat, carrying a leather bag that smelled of carbolic and camphor. He climbed the stairs to the heir's room while Sarah paced the kitchen below. Lungs are clear, the doctor said when he came down, but the fever's stubborn. He needs rest. Will he live? Sarah's voice was barely a whisper. If he doesn't push too hard. But he's determined to go to town again before Thursday. The little girl looked up from where she sat, mending a torn apron. We all got to go to town. When the clerk comes back. Doctor. Hartwell studied her with kind eyes. You're the child with the good memory, aren't you? Yes, sir. They say you noticed something odd about Duggan's papers. She set down her mending. The seal's wrong. Made with the wrong wax, pressed backward. The doctor pulled a chair close to hers. That's quite an accusation. You certain? Instead of answering, the little girl closed her eyes and began to recite. John Whitmore, probate clerk, Adams County, Mississippi. Ring seal shows J. Whitmore, probate in raised letters, uses black wax, heated to smoking, presses firm and straight, no tremor in the hand. She opened her eyes. Duggan's paper shows red wax, old and flaking. Letters in the press read, Whitmore J, probate. Like somebody tried to copy from memory and got it turned around. Doctor. Hartwell leaned back in his chair. How old are you, child? 10, sir. Near 11. And you remember all that from seeing the clerk's seal once? I seen it more than once, but once would be enough. She picked up her mending again. Some things stick. That afternoon, the heir came down from his room, moving slow but steady. His fever had broken, leaving his eyes clear and determined. We need to see the clerk's assistant again, he said to Sarah. Need to compare. Duggan's paper with a real seal. Doctor said you should rest. I'll rest when you're free. He reached for her hand. When we can stand before God and man as husband and wife. The little girl looked up from her sewing. The assistant? He wears a ring too, same as the clerk's. I seen him press it into wax. The heir nodded. Then we'll ask him to show us how it's supposed to look. But when they reached town the next day, they found the courthouse buzzing with different news. The assistant clerk met them at the door, his face grave. Heard you folks had questions about seal authenticity, he said without preamble. That's right, the heir replied. The assistant led them to the probate office, where afternoon light slanted through tall windows. The wax pots still smoked on their warming plate, red and black side by side. Funny thing, the assistant said, settling behind the desk. Had another fellow in here yesterday, asking about the same kind of paper you brought. He pulled a document from a drawer. Fellow named Morrison, from over Woodville Way. Had a travel pass, looked just like the one your overseer showed. Sarah's breath caught. Same kind of pass, same red wax, same backward letters in the seal. The assistant held up the paper. Morrison was smart enough to ask questions before he paid money on it. The little girl stepped closer to the desk. You found more fake papers? 3 so far. All the same pattern, red wax instead of black, letters in the clerk's name transposed. The assistant's ring caught the light as he gestured. Somebody's been busy making counterfeit documents. The heir's face hardened. Somebody's been cheating folks. That's what it looks like. The assistant opened his ledger and found a fresh page. Now, about your manumission papers. I can record those today if you want. No debt holds up when the supporting documents are proven false. But before he could dip his pen, running footsteps sounded in the hallway. A boy burst through the door, breathing hard. "Mr. Clerk, sir," the boy gasped. "Duggan sent me. Says to tell you the river's rising fast. Wants to move the account reading to tonight. Says he's got creditors coming who can't wait till Thursday." The assistant clerk frowned. "Tonight? That's not how we do things." "Says it's an emergency, sir. Something about the bridge going out." The little girl's ribbon fluttered as she turned toward the window. Dark clouds massed on the horizon, and wind bent the trees until their leaves showed silver. "Storm's coming," she said quietly. "Big one." The assistant looked from the boy to the gathering clouds. "If the bridge goes out, folks won't be able to get to town Thursday anyway." "Sir," the little girl said, her voice carrying a note the adults hadn't heard before. "That hymn I've been humming? It's got a verse about high water and wrong crossings." The heir looked at her sharply. "What kind of wrong crossings?" She closed her eyes, listening to something only she could hear. When she opened them, her face was serious as stone. "When the water rises fast, that's when bad folks try to push through deals that wouldn't stand in clear weather. Granny said songs remember things like that." Thunder rolled across the town like a warning drum, and the first fat raindrops splattered against the courthouse windows. The assistant clerk looked at his wax pots, then at the papers on his desk, then at the little girl's solemn face. "I think," he said slowly, "we better be extra careful about which papers we trust tonight." The storm hit just after supper time, turning Main Street into a shallow river and the courthouse steps slick as glass. But folks came anyway, drawn by word that spread through town like wildfire about fake passes and forced account readings. Lanterns bobbed through the rain-dark streets as people gathered under the courthouse portico. The heir and Sarah arrived in a borrowed wagon, the little girl squeezed between them, her ribbon bright in the lantern light. Duggan was already there, his ledger wrapped in oilcloth, the disputed pass tucked inside his coat. He stood apart from the crowd, his eyes darting from face to face like a cornered animal. The assistant clerk appeared in the courthouse doorway, an oil lamp in one hand and a wooden box in the other. "Folks," he called, over the sound of rain drumming on the roof. "We got a situation here needs sorting. Best we do it right the first time." He set the lamp on a makeshift table, constructed from sawhorses and a plank. The wooden box he placed beside it with ceremony. "This here's the official seal kit," he announced. "Got the clerk's ring, the genuine wax pots, and samples of every legal document this office has issued in the past 5 years." Murmurs ran through the crowd. Someone called out, "What about that travel pass?" Duggan stepped forward, pulling the disputed document from his coat. "Here's the pass. Legal as daylight." The assistant clerk took it, holding it close to the lamp. Rain drummed harder, and water dripped through gaps in the portico roof into buckets placed to catch it. "Well," the clerk said after a long moment, "let's see what we can see." He opened the wooden box and lifted out a silver ring, the same one the little girl had watched him use days before. Then he selected a stick of black wax and held it over the lamp flame until it began to soften. "This is how a real seal gets made," he said, pressing the ring into the warm wax. The impression came out clean and sharp. J. Whitmore, probate. Then he held Duggan's pass beside the fresh impression. Even in the flickering lamplight, the differences were clear. The red wax looked dull and powdery compared to the rich black, and the letters, "Whitmore J, probate," read a voice from the crowd. "Stead of J, Whitmore, probate." The little girl stepped closer to the table. "Can I see the ledger now?" Duggan pulled the book against his chest. "That's private business records." "Not anymore, it isn't," the assistant clerk said. "If you're claiming debt against a person seeking manumission, this office has a right to examine the supporting documentation." Reluctantly, Duggan set the ledger on the table. The little girl opened it carefully, her small fingers turning pages until she found what she was looking for. "Here," she said, pointing to a line of figures, $50 for cloth and tonics, dated last month." "That's right," Duggan said. The little girl turned back several pages. "And here, same $50, same date, but listed under Martha Webb instead of Sarah Clark." A gasp ran through the crowd. Sarah pressed closer to see. "Same handwriting, same ink, same amount," the little girl continued. "Like somebody wrote it twice to make the debt look bigger." The assistant clerk studied both entries under the lamplight. This is the same transaction recorded twice under different names. That's, Duggan's voice trailed off. That's fraud, said a voice from the crowd. The preacher stepped forward, rain dripping from his hat brim. There's more, he said quietly. Show them the other thing, child. The little girl reached into her pocket and pulled out a small piece of cloth, a scrap of quilt, binding tied with careful stitches. Found this sewn into Granny's old quilt, she said, stitched tight so it wouldn't come loose. She untied the binding and unfolded a strip of paper narrow as a ribbon, covered with tiny handwriting. What is it? Someone called. The preacher took the paper and held it close to the lamp. His voice carried clear over the rain as he read, Final instruction of William Thornton, witnessed and sealed this day. Sarah Clark and her sister, being daughters of Mary Clark, deceased, shall be freed upon my death, together with all other mothers and daughters named in the Bible kept in my desk drawer. This clause supersedes all other arrangements, sealed with the official ring of J. Whitmore, probate clerk, Adams County. Silence fell over the crowd. Even the rain seemed to pause. The assistant clerk reached into his box and pulled out a small black book. The Bible, he mentions. Clerk's been keeping it safe since the old man died. He opened the book to a page marked with a ribbon. Names were written in the margins in faded ink. Mary Clark and daughters Sarah and Ruth, Rebecca Johnson and daughter Anna, Martha Webb and daughters Lucy and Sue. All the names from the ledger, the little girl said softly. The real names, not the made-up debt ones. The assistant clerk pressed his ring into fresh black wax and compared the impression to the mark at the bottom of the paper strip. They matched perfectly. This is a legal manumission clause, he said. Takes precedence over any claimed debt. He looked directly at Sarah. You and your sister are free by law. A cheer went up from the crowd, but it was quickly hushed by the sound of running feet. A deputy burst through the rain, his coat streaming water. Bridge is out, he announced. River took it an hour ago, roads flooding too. The heir looked at Sarah, then at the little girl. How do we get back home? The little girl tilted her head, listening to something beneath the storm noise. Then she began to hum the same melody she'd been carrying for days, but different verses now. The crossing song, the preacher said, recognition dawning in his voice. Follow the ferry poles, the little girl sang softly. Follow the cypress knees. 2 doors on the far side, one safe, one trouble. She looked up at the faces gathered around the lamp. I can get us home. But we got to go now, before the water gets higher. Lightning split the sky as if to underscore her words. The assistant clerk quickly gathered his papers and seal, wrapping everything in oilcloth. I'm coming with you, he said. Need to see these manumission papers properly recorded. The crowd began to disperse, some heading for higher ground in town, others following the little girl's steady voice as she led them toward the river landing. Duggan stood alone under the portico, his false papers scattered by the wind, watching the lamplight disappear into the storm. The river had swallowed the world. What had been solid ground that morning now lay beneath 3 feet of muddy water that reflected the lightning-torn sky like a broken mirror. The little girl stood at the edge of the flood, her ribbon dark with rain, humming verses that seemed to pull paths out of the chaos. Ferry's still running, called the boatman from his shelter near the landing. But I ain't promising nothing about the roads on the far side. The assistant clerk clutched his oilcloth bundle tighter. How long before this water goes down? Could be days, the boatman replied. Could be weeks. River ain't been this high since '47. The heir helped Sarah down from their borrowed wagon, his face pale but determined. Behind them, a handful of townspeople had gathered the preacher, Dr. Hartwell, and 3 men from the general store who'd witnessed the seal comparison. Child, the preacher said gently, you sure you know the way? The little girl closed her eyes and let the song flow through her. When she opened them, she pointed toward a stand of cypress trees whose tops still showed above the flood. Ferry poles mark the deep channel, cypress knees show the shallows. We follow the knees when we can, poles when we can't. Her voice carried certainty that seemed older than her 10 years. Granny's song don't lie. Dr. Hartwell studied the dark water with concern. What if the song's wrong? What if it's too old to be accurate? Songs don't age the same as people, the little girl said, simply. Water finds the same paths every time. The boatman emerged from his shelter, pulling a wide-brimmed hat down over his eyes. If we're going, We're going now. Water's still rising. They loaded into the ferry a flat-bottomed scow with room for 2 wagons. The mules rolled their eyes at the swirling water, but the little girl moved among them, humming, and they settled. "That's a gift," Dr. Hartwell murmured to Sarah. "The way she calms things." Sarah watched her sister with something like wonder. She's always been that way. Even as a baby, she could quiet a storm just by singing to it. The ferry pushed off into the current. Water lapped over the sides, and the boatman worked his long poles with practiced ease. But after a few minutes, he shook his head. "Channels shifted," he called over the storm noise. "Can't find the markers." The little girl moved to the front of the boat. She leaned out over the water, her ribbon trailing in the current, and began to sing louder. Her voice cut through the rain like a blade of light. "When the water runs muddy and the landmarks drown, follow the cypress, follow the crown. 1 knee, 2 knee, 3 in a line. That's the safe path, that's the sign." As if summoned by her song, a cypress knee broke the surface 20 yards ahead, a knobby protrusion that marked shallow water. Then another appeared, and another, forming a rough line toward the far shore. "I'll be damned," breathed the boatman. He poled toward the first knee, testing the depth. 18 inches, just like she said. They followed the cypress knees through the flood, the little girl's voice guiding them past submerged fences and hidden ditches. The heir sat close to Sarah, his arm around her shoulders, watching the child who seemed to read the water like a book. "How does she know?" he whispered. "Same way she knows everything else," Sarah replied. "She listens to things the rest of us can't hear." Halfway across, they encountered another boat, a small skiff carrying 3 men in rain slickers. One of them hailed the ferry. "Y'all seen any sign of Duggan? He's supposed to meet us at the landing." The assistant clerk stood up, water dripping from his coat. "Who's asking?" "Business associates. We had a deal set for tonight." The preacher stepped forward. "What kind of deal?" The man in the bow shrugged. "Debt collection. Nothing that concerns you." But the little girl had stopped singing. She studied the 3 men with the same careful attention she'd given to the fake seal. Something in their faces made her ribbon flutter despite the still air inside the ferry. "You the ones buying papers from Duggan?" she asked. The men exchanged glances. "Papers?" "False papers, travel passes, and debt claims, made with the wrong wax and backward letters." The man in the bow leaned forward. "You calling us cheats, little girl?" "I'm saying what I see." The child's voice stayed level. "And I see men who know their business just went bad." Lightning flashed, and in its glare, the little girl spotted something else, a larger boat moving through the flood parallel to theirs, keeping pace but staying in the deeper water. "Boatman," she called softly. "We got followers." The boatman glanced over his shoulder without stopping his poling. "How many?" 6, maybe 7, in a launch with oars. The men in the skiff had heard. The one in the bow called across the water, "Duggan's boys. They'll want to parley." "Nothing to parley about," the assistant clerk called back. "Duggan's papers are proven false. Any debts based on them are void." "That's for the courts to decide," the man replied. "After we collect what's owed." The heir stood, his hand moving instinctively to his coat pocket, where he carried a small pistol. "There's no debt. The manumission clause clears all claims." "What manumission clause?" The little girl began to hum again, but this time the melody was different, sharper, more urgent. She pointed toward a gap between 2 large cypress trees. "That way," she told the boatman. "Quick as you can." The boatman didn't argue. He drove his pole deep and sent the ferry surging toward the gap. Behind them, shouts erupted from both following boats. "Why that way?" Sarah asked her sister. "Song says there's a channel through them trees. Deep enough for us, too shallow for their launch." The little girl's voice stayed calm, but her knuckles were white where she gripped the ferry's rail. "And there's something else on the far side." "What?" "Help." They squeezed through the cypress gap with inches to spare. The launch tried to follow but ground against a submerged log. Cursing carried across the water as the oarsmen worked to free their boat. The skiff made it through, but barely. One of the men had to jump overboard and push while the others poled. "They're still coming," Dr. Hartwell observed. The little girl nodded. "But look ahead." Through the rain and gathering darkness, lights flickered on the far shore, not the scattered glow of individual homes, but the organized pattern of lanterns arranged in formation. "What is that?" the heir asked. The preacher shaded his eyes with his hand. "Folks from the African church. They heard about the account reading, came down to witness." As they drew closer, the lights resolved into people, dozens of them standing in the shallows with lanterns raised. Men, women, children, all singing the same crossing song the little girl had been humming. How did they know to come? Sarah wondered. Word travels fast in flood time, the preacher said, especially when it's about freedom papers. The ferry grounded on a muddy bank, and willing hands reached out to help them ashore. The assistant clerk held his oilcloth bundle high as he waded through knee-deep water. Behind them, the skiff had managed to navigate the Cypress Gap, but the men aboard looked uncertain as they saw the crowd of witnesses waiting on shore. "Evening, gentlemen?" called an elderly man from the church group. "Y'all need assistance?" The man in the bow of the skiff looked around at all the lantern-lit faces, then back toward the deeper water, where the launch was still struggling with the log. "We're looking for a man named Duggan," he said finally. "Haven't seen him," the old man replied pleasantly, "but you're welcome to wait with us. Going to be a long night with this flood." The little girl waded ashore, her ribbon streaming water. She walked directly to the old man and whispered something in his ear. His eyebrows rose, and he nodded gravely. "Brothers," he called to the men in the skiff, "y'all know anything about false papers? Travel passes made with wrong-colored wax?" The men exchanged glances again. "Don't know what you're talking about." "Funny thing," the old man continued. "Had 3 families from our church get cheated by papers just like that, paid good money for fake travel documents, made them think they owed debts they never took on." Murmurs arose from the crowd. Someone called out, "My cousin Martha got took that way. $50 for a pass that wasn't worth the paper it was printed on." The little girl stepped forward, water still dripping from her clothes. In the lantern light, her young face looked ancient with knowledge. "The man who made them false papers," she said clearly. "He's been working with buyers who know they ain't real. They split the money from folks who don't know better." The man in the bow started to protest, but the old man held up his hand. "Child's got a gift for seeing truth," he said. "Might be best if y'all moved along. Water's rising, and honest folks got business to conduct." Behind them, the launch finally freed itself from the log, but instead of approaching shore, it began to retreat into deeper water. The men in the skiff watched it go, their faces dark with anger. "This ain't over," one of them called. "Yes, it is," the little girl said simply. "Papers are proven false. Debts based on lies don't stand. Your business with Duggan's done." The skiff pushed off, following the launch back into the flood. The crowd on shore watched until both boats disappeared into the rain-swept darkness. The old man turned to the assistant clerk. "You got papers? Need witnessing?" The clerk nodded, still clutching his oilcloth bundle. "Manumission documents. Legal and proper. Then let's see them done right." They found shelter in an abandoned store whose upper floor stayed dry above the flood. Lanterns were arranged around a makeshift table, and the assistant clerk opened his bundle with ceremony. The manumission papers lay clean and official beside the Bible with its margin notes. The clerk's ring gleamed in the lamplight next to pots of black wax. "Sarah Clark," the clerk called. "Step forward." Sarah moved to the table, her hand in the airs. Water still dripped from their clothes, but their faces shone in the lantern light. "By authority of the Adams County Probate Court," the clerk continued, "and in accordance with the final wishes of William Thornton, deceased, I hereby record the manumission of Sarah Clark, age 23, daughter of Mary Clark, deceased." He pressed his ring into warm black wax and sealed the document. The impression came out clean and true. "J. Whitmore, probate." "Ruth Clark," he called next. The little girl stepped forward, suddenly looking every bit the child she was. Her ribbon was tangled and muddy, her dress torn from the boat journey. "Age 10 years, sister to the above Sarah Clark, daughter of Mary Clark, deceased, free by the same provision." Another seal, another document. The crowd began to sing softly, not the crossing song this time, but something deeper and older, full of joy and thanksgiving. The heir stepped forward. "If Sarah's willing," he said, his voice carrying over the singing, "I'd like to ask the preacher to marry us, here, tonight, With all these witnesses, Sarah looked at him with eyes bright as stars. I'm willing. But before the preacher could speak, the little girl held up her hand. Wait, she said. There's something else needs doing first. She pulled the quilt binding from her pocket, the strip of cloth that had held the hidden manumission clause. This binding came from Granny's freedom quilt. She made it the day she got her papers, stitched every scrap and thread with prayers. The child's voice grew stronger. She told me when I was little that the binding held more than just cloth pieces. Said it held promises. She began to untie more knots in the binding, revealing additional strips of paper hidden between the layers. Marriage lines, she said, unfolding each slip carefully. For the unions that couldn't happen while folks were property. Granny kept them all, waiting for the day they could be made legal. She handed one strip to the preacher. Mama and Daddy's names, they never got to stand before witnesses proper. Another strip, Rebecca and Samuel Johnson. They'd been together 15 years, got 3 children, but never had a legal ceremony. Strip after strip, each containing names and dates written in careful script. All the marriages that got put off, the little girl said. All the vows that waited for freedom. The preacher took the strips with reverent hands. How many couples? 14. The child's voice was steady, including Sarah and him. She looked at the heir, then at her sister. If you're going to do this, might as well do it right. Make all the unions that should have been made long ago. The crowd had grown quiet, the weight of the moment settling over them like a blessing. Outside, the flood continued to rise, but inside the abandoned store, lantern light made a circle of warmth and hope. The heir took Sarah's hand. Would that be all right? To stand with all the others? Sarah's smile could have lit the whole river. I can't think of anything better. The preacher cleared his throat. Then let's call them forward. All the couples who've been waiting. One by one, they came to the makeshift altar. Some had been together for decades, some for just a few years. All had waited for this moment when they could publicly declare what they'd felt in private. The assistant clerk prepared his seal and wax, ready to make each union officially recorded. The little girl stood to one side, her muddy ribbon bright in the lantern light, watching the faces of people who had never dared hope for this moment. Outside, thunder rolled across the flood like a benediction. Inside, voices rose in harmony as the preacher began to speak the words that would bind 14 couples in law as they had long been bound in love. The little girl closed her eyes and listened to the music of it, not just the singing, but the deeper sound of promises being made and kept, of dreams given form in witness and ink. When she opened her eyes, she noticed something that made her heart skip. Through the store's front window, she could see more lights moving across the water, not the hostile glow of Duggan's men, but the gentle bobbing of lanterns carried by friends. More folks coming, she murmured to the preacher. He paused in his ceremony and looked where she pointed. From the white church, he said with surprise. Didn't expect them to brave the flood. The additional boats arrived as the first marriages were being recorded. Among the new arrivals were several members of the county's white families, not all of them, but enough to matter. The Quaker neighbor was there, along with Dr. Hartwell's wife and children. Even the mayor had come, though he stood somewhat apart from the others. Heard about the account reading, the mayor explained when someone asked why he'd come, wanted to see justice done. The little girl studied his face in the lantern light, reading the patterns she found there. After a moment, she nodded to herself. He was telling the truth, as far as it went. The preacher resumed his work, and one by one, the waiting couples stepped forward. Each ceremony was brief but heartfelt, each seal pressed into wax with careful attention to detail. When it came time for Sarah and the heir, the crowd fell completely silent. This was the moment that had started it all, the public marriage proposal that had shocked the county and set everything else in motion. Thomas Thornton, the preacher said, using the heir's full name. Do you take Sarah Clark, formerly enslaved, now free, to be your lawful wedded wife? I do, the heir said, his voice clear and strong. Sarah Clark, do you take Thomas Thornton to be your lawful wedded husband? I do, Sarah replied, and her voice carried joy like a river carries light. The preacher nodded to the assistant clerk, who prepared a fresh sheet of paper. Then by the authority vested in me by the church and witnessed by this assembly, I pronounce you husband and wife. The clerk pressed his seal into black wax one final time. The impression came out perfect. J. Whitmore, probate, surrounded by the signatures of 24 witnesses. As the couple kissed, the crowd erupted in celebration. But the little girl wasn't watching the kiss. She was watching the window, where new lights had appeared on the water. These weren't friends. Trouble coming, she said quietly to the preacher. He followed her gaze and saw what she had seen, a large boat moving purposefully through the flood, carrying more men than could be accounted for by curiosity. "Duggan?" he asked. The little girl shook her head. Bigger trouble than that. She moved to the window and peered out into the storm. Lightning illuminated the approaching boat, and she could see uniforms among the passengers. "Patrollers?" she said. "And lawmen. Somebody sent word about the marriages." The celebration quieted as her words spread through the crowd. Mixed marriages were legal in some places, illegal in others. The law was unclear and often came down to local interpretation. The heir stepped protectively in front of Sarah. "What do we do?" The little girl was already moving, gathering up the scattered paper strips and stuffing them back into her quilt binding. "We follow the song," she said simply. "There's more verses yet." She began to hum again, but this melody was different from the crossing song. This one spoke of hidden paths and secret doors, of ways through darkness that only those who listened carefully could find. "Backstairs," she said, pointing toward the rear of the store. "Song says there's a backstairs leads to the loft. Door up there opens onto the roof." "And then what?" "Doctor," Hartwell asked. The little girl's eyes gleamed in the lantern light. "Then we follow the Freedom Line. Same path the old songs always knew." Outside, the patroller's boat scraped against the store's front porch. Heavy footsteps splashed through the floodwater. "Everyone who wants to stay free," the little girl said urgently, "follow me. Everyone else, act like you came to help with flood rescue." Half the crowd began filing toward the back stairs. The other half arranged themselves around the remaining lanterns, making busy work of sorting through imaginary flood debris. The little girl was the last to leave. She took one final look at the table where the marriages had been recorded, memorizing the scene, the official seals gleaming in wax, the signatures of witnesses, the faces of people who had waited so long for this moment. Then she followed the others up the back stairs, her ribbon streaming behind her like a banner, her voice carrying the freedom song that would guide them safely through whatever darkness lay ahead. Behind them, the front door of the store burst open, and authoritative voices demanded to know what was going on. But by then, the little girl and her followers were already climbing out onto the roof, following verses that promised safe passage for those brave enough to trust in songs older than the laws of men. The flood spread below them like a dark mirror, reflecting stars between the storm clouds. Somewhere in the distance, dogs bayed as patrollers tried to pick up a trail that had already gone cold. The little girl smiled and began the next verse of her song, the one that told of morning coming and justice, and the sweet sound of freedom bells ringing clear across the water. The roof sloped steep as a church spire, slick with rain that drummed like fingertips on tin. The little girl moved across the shingles, sure as a cat, her ribbon streaming in the wind, leading a line of people who had no choice but to trust a child's memory of an old song. Below, voices echoed through the flooded store. Heavy boots splashed from room to room as the patrollers searched for evidence of illegal assembly. Where'd they all go? The question drifted up through gaps in the roof boards. "Must have moved on when they saw us coming," came the reply. "Flood's got everyone scattered tonight." The little girl pressed her finger to her lips, then pointed toward the edge of the roof, where a thick oak branch stretched like a bridge to the next building. The assistant clerk still clutched his oilcloth bundle of papers, his face pale in the starlight. One by one, they crossed the gap. Sarah went first, her new husband's hand steadying her until she reached safety. The newlyweds followed 14 couples who had waited years for the chance to be legally married, now fleeing into the night to protect those marriages. The little girl went last, pausing at the edge to listen to the sounds below. The patrollers were questioning the people who'd remained behind, but finding nothing actionable. Mixed marriages might be questioned, but flood rescue was a Christian duty no one could argue with. She swung across the branch and dropped onto the next roof, just as Dr. Hartwell's voice rose from the store below. "Terrible thing, this flood. Lucky we had folks willing to help with the evacuation," the preacher's bass rumble added. Been moving stranded families to higher ground all evening. Christian obligation in times like these. The little girl smiled despite the danger. Even in the midst of deception, these were truthful men. They had been moving people to higher ground, just not the way the patrollers expected. "This way," she whispered, pointing toward a ladder that led down to an alley between buildings. The alley ran deep with flood water, but a narrow walkway along one wall stayed dry enough for passage. The little girl led them single file, her bare feet finding purchase on wet boards, while others slipped and stumbled behind her. "How do you know where you're going?" the assistant clerk whispered. "Song tells me," she replied softly. "Every verse maps out a different path. This one's for when the law dogs are running." They reached the end of the alley and emerged onto what had been Main Street before the flood claimed it. Water stretched in all directions, reflecting the few lights still burning in upper windows. "Now what?" asked one of the newly married men. The little girl closed her eyes and hummed a few bars under her breath. When she opened them, she pointed toward a church steeple that rose above the flood like an island. "Safe house," she said simply. "Song says the church bell tower's got a room with provisions. Dry blankets, food put by for emergencies." "How far?" Sarah asked. "Quarter-mile. But we got to be careful. Water's deeper here. And—" she paused, listening to something only she could hear. "Sounds like they're bringing dogs." Sure enough, baying echoed across the flooded town. Hounds picked up scent trails, following paths through the water that only animals could detect. "Dogs can't track through deep water," the preacher observed. "These ain't regular tracking hounds," the little girl said grimly. "These are the kind trained to hunt people. They follow fear scent as much as footprints." She began to hum again, a new verse with a different rhythm. "Got to stay calm, got to trust the song. Fear makes scent trails bright as lantern light to dogs like these." They waded into the deeper water, moving in single file with the little girl in the lead. The current was stronger here, and several times people stumbled or lost their footing. But each time, the child's steady voice pulled them back on course. Halfway to the church, they encountered another group of refugees, a family with small children trying to reach higher ground. The mother carried a baby who couldn't stop crying, the sound carrying across the water like a bell. "Hush, now," the woman kept saying, but the baby only cried harder. The little girl waded over to them. "May I?" she asked politely. The mother looked uncertain, but desperation won out. She passed the baby to the strange child with the ribbon and the songs. The little girl took the infant and immediately began to hum not one of her navigation songs, but something older and deeper, full of warmth and safety. The baby's cries faded to hiccups, then silence. "How did you do that?" the mother whispered. "Babies hear truth clearer than grown folks," the little girl replied, still humming softly. "They know when someone's trying to help." Behind them, the baying of the hounds grew closer. The family with small children couldn't move fast enough to reach the church before the dogs arrived. "Take them toward the courthouse," the little girl told her sister. "Bell tower at the church is big enough for our group, but not for everyone. These folks need different shelter. What about you?" The little girl handed the now sleeping baby back to its mother. "I'm going to lay a false trail. Lead the dogs away from both groups." Sarah grabbed her sister's arm. "That's too dangerous." "No more dangerous than anything else we done tonight." The child's voice held quiet certainty. "Song's got verses for this too. Trust me." Before anyone could stop her, the little girl waded back toward the town center, moving deliberately through the shallows where her scent would be strongest. Her voice carried across the water, not humming now, but singing, full-throated, as if she wanted every dog in the county to hear her. "Follow the drinking gourd, follow the drinking gourd, for the old man is waiting for to carry you to freedom. Follow the drinking gourd." The ancient song echoed off the flooded buildings, mixing with the sound of baying hounds, until it was impossible to tell where one ended and the other began. Sarah watched her sister disappear into the darkness, then turned to the assistant clerk. "She's buying us time. We better use it." The group split, according to the little girl's instructions. Sarah led the newly married couples toward the church bell tower, while the family with children headed for the courthouse square where other refugees had gathered. As they waded through the deepening water, the clerk couldn't stop looking back toward the sound of the dogs. "Will she be all right?" "She's got more verses than anybody," Sarah replied, but worry edged her voice. Question is whether she'll need them all. The church loomed ahead of them, its steeple rising above the flood like a pointing finger. Stone steps led up to doors that stayed dry above the waterline. But as they approached, a new sound made them freeze. Voices, coming from inside the church. "Somebody's already here," the preacher whispered. They crept closer, trying to identify the speakers through the thick stone walls. After a moment, Sarah's face cleared with relief. "It's the Quaker neighbor," she said, "and some of the folks from his meeting." Indeed, when they pushed open the church doors, they found a dozen members of the local Quaker community arranging blankets and provisions in the nave. Lanterns cast warm circles of light, and a small fire burned safely in a metal brazier. "Friends," the Quaker neighbor said, looking up from his work. "We wondered when you'd arrive." "How did you know we were coming?" the assistant clerk asked. "Same way you knew to come here. The songs are older than any of us." The neighbor's eyes twinkled. "We've been following freedom lines longer than most." They climbed the narrow stairs to the bell tower, where more supplies waited. Dry clothes, bread, cheese, even some medicine. Everything needed for people who might have to wait out more than just a flood. "You planned this," Sarah realized. "We hoped we'd never need to," the neighbor replied. "But when word spread about Duggan's false papers and forced account readings, we figured tonight might be the night for old songs and older preparations." Through the bell tower windows, they could see across the flooded town. Dogs still bayed in the distance, but the sound was moving away from them now, following the false trail the little girl had laid. "She's leading them toward the old mill pond," the preacher observed, watching the pattern of movement through the darkness. "Good place for it," the neighbor agreed. "Deep water, lots of scent confusion. Dogs'll lose the trail there for sure." But as they watched, a new concern arose. More boats were moving across the flood, not just patrollers now, but what looked like organized searchers with systematic patterns. "They're not just following dogs anymore," the assistant clerk said grimly. "They're treating this like a manhunt." Sarah pressed her face to the window, trying to spot her sister in the maze of flooded streets. "She's just a little girl. They wouldn't hurt a child." The Quaker neighbor's expression grew grave. "They might, if they thought she was the key to finding everyone else." As if summoned by their worry, a new sound reached them, not the baying of hounds, but a human voice singing clear and strong across the water. "Wade in the water, wade in the water, children, wade in the water. God's gonna trouble the water." The little girl's voice carried perfectly across the flood, and her song served a double purpose. Not only did it tell her followers where she was, it also carried coded information about safe routes and dangerous areas. "She's at the mill pond," the preacher said, relief evident in his voice. "And she's found a way out," the song continued, each verse mapping out a path back toward the church. But it also told of new dangers, more boats converging, more men with dogs, and something else that made the listeners in the bell tower exchange worried glances. "Listen to that verse," the neighbor said urgently. "The one about morning bells and Judgment Day." The little girl's voice came clear across the water. "When you hear them morning bells, when you hear them morning bells, children, run and hide, run and hide. Judgment Day is coming with the morning bells." "Dawn Patrol," the assistant clerk translated grimly. "They're bringing in more men at first light." Through the windows, they could see the eastern horizon beginning to pale. Storm clouds still massed overhead, but beneath them, the sky held the grey promise of morning. "She can't stay out there much longer," Sarah said. "Even if the dogs don't find her, she'll be caught in the open when full daylight comes." The preacher moved toward the stairs. "I'm going after her." "Wait." The Quaker neighbor held up his hand. "Listen." The song had changed again. This time the little girl sang about safe harbors and friendly shores, about lights in the darkness that guided travelers home. "Follow the lantern, follow the light, follow the beacon burning bright. Safe harbors waiting through the night. Follow the lantern, follow the light." As she sang, a small light appeared in the distance, not the harsh glare of a searcher's torch, but the warm glow of a single lantern moving steadily through the flood. "She's coming back," Sarah breathed, but the light wasn't alone. Other lights followed it, some friendly, some clearly hostile. The little girl was leading a parade of pursuers straight toward the church. "She's bringing them here on purpose," the neighbor realized, "drawing them away from the other safe houses." "But why?" The answer came in the next verse of the song. When the rooster crows at break of day, when the rooster crows at break of day, children, truth will shine, truth will shine. Paper's gonna speak when the rooster crows at break of day. The assistant clerk clutched his oilcloth bundle tighter. She wants them to see the documents, wants everything out in the open, in front of witnesses, the preacher added, understanding dawning on his face. She's staging a public revelation. Outside, the approaching lights resolved into individual boats. The little girl's lantern led them all, weaving through the flood with purpose and precision. Behind her came patrollers, lawmen, curious townspeople, and even some of Duggan's associates who had managed to navigate the treacherous waters. "All right," the Quaker neighbor said, rolling up his sleeves. "If she wants a public confrontation, let's give her one worth having." He began moving around the bell tower, adjusting lanterns and positioning witnesses where they could best see and hear what was coming. The newly married couples arranged themselves in a semicircle, their hands joined, their faces showing the quiet dignity of people who had nothing left to hide. The assistant clerk checked his papers one final time, making sure the seals were clear and the signatures legible. This might be the most important document reading of his career. Outside, the little girl's voice rose one final time. "This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. Let it shine. Let it shine. Let it shine." Her lantern bobbed closer to the church steps, and behind it came the flotilla of followers, believers, and skeptics, friends and enemies, all drawn by the promise of truth revealed in the morning light. Sarah descended the bell tower stairs and opened the church doors just as her sister waded up to the entrance. The little girl stood dripping in the doorway, her ribbon muddy but still bright, her eyes shining with the kind of certainty that comes from knowing exactly what needs to happen next. "Morning's coming," she announced to the crowd that pressed behind her. "Time for papers to speak and truth to shine." Lightning flickered in the eastern sky, but it wasn't storm lightning anymore. It was the electricity of dawn breaking over a world transformed by flood and song, and the quiet courage of a child who had never learned to doubt the power of truth. Dawn came pale and clean, washing the flood with silver light. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world transformed streets become rivers, familiar landmarks swallowed by water, the ordinary business of life suspended, while nature reminded everyone who was really in charge. The little girl stood on the church steps, her muddy ribbon bright in the morning light, watching boats converge from all directions. Word had spread through the night, like ripples on water. Something important was happening at the Methodist Church, something about freedom papers and false documents and marriages that shocked the county. The assistant clerk emerged from the church, carrying his oilcloth bundle, the all-important papers that would settle the matter once and for all. Behind him came Sarah and the heir, now husband and wife, by law as well as love, followed by the other newly married couples whose unions had been sealed in the desperate hours before dawn. Patrollers tied their boats to the church railings. Townspeople waded through shallow water, drawn by curiosity and the promise of drama. Even the mayor had come, along with 2 county supervisors and a circuit judge who happened to be in town when the flood hit. Duggan arrived in a skiff with 3 other men, his face dark with anger and something that might have been fear. He carried his ledger wrapped in canvas, protecting the documents that had started all the trouble. "There she is," he called, pointing at the little girl, "the one causing all the commotion, filling folks' heads with nonsense about fake papers." The little girl looked at him with the same calm attention she gave to everything else. "Morning, Mr. Duggan. Brought your ledger, I see. Brought proof of debt. Legal debt. That's got to be satisfied before any manumission papers get recorded." The circuit judge, a heavy-set man with silver whiskers, settled himself on the church steps like a throne. "Someone want to tell me what this is all about?" The assistant clerk stepped forward and began unwrapping his bundle. "Dispute over manumission papers, Your Honor. Question of authentic documents versus forgeries." "Forgeries?" The judge's eyebrows rose. "That's a serious charge. Serious facts to back it up," the little girl said simply. She moved to stand beside the clerk's makeshift table, her small hands arranging papers with the precision of someone much older. "This child's been causing trouble all night," Duggan protested. "Got folks believing wild stories about seal colors and backward letters." "Let's see these documents," the judge said. "All of them." The assistant clerk laid out the manumission papers. First clean, official, properly sealed with black wax. Then he produced the Bible with its margin notes, the names of mothers and daughters written in faded ink. Final instructions of William Thornton, deceased, the clerk explained. Hidden clause requiring manumission of specific families upon his death. Duggan slammed his ledger down on the table. Debt supersedes any such clause. Sarah Clark owes $50 in advances, plus travel expenses. He pulled out the disputed travel pass, its red wax seal catching the morning light. The little girl studied the document, then looked up at the crowd of faces surrounding the church steps. How many folks here ever seen the county clerk's official seal? Hands went up around the gathering. The judge nodded. Most people have seen it at one time or another. What color wax does the clerk use? Black? Called someone from the crowd. Always black. The little girl pointed at Duggan's pass. This seal's made with red wax. Red wax that flakes when you touch it, like it's old and been reheated. She picked up the document and held it where everyone could see. And look at the letters in the impression. The assistant clerk produced his own ring, the same one used to make all legitimate seals. He pressed it into warm black wax, creating a fresh impression right there on the church steps. J. Whitmore, probate, he read from his seal. The little girl held Duggan's pass beside it. Whitmore J. Probate. Letters in the wrong order, like somebody tried to copy from memory and got confused. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. The judge leaned forward to examine both seals under the brightening daylight. There does appear to be a discrepancy, he said slowly. That proves nothing, Duggan insisted, but sweat beaded his forehead despite the cool morning air. The little girl opened the ledger to the page she had memorized during the night's chaos. Here's where it gets interesting, she said to the crowd. Mr. Duggan's book shows Sarah Clark owes $50 for cloth and tonics. She turned back several pages. But here, same amount, same date, same handwriting, but listed under Martha Webb instead. The judge studied both entries. Same transaction recorded twice. Yes, sir, under different names, to make the debt look bigger than it really is. The little girl's voice carried clearly across the gathered crowd. That's fraud. Now wait just a minute, Duggan started, but the judge held up his hand. Let the child finish. The little girl pulled the quilt, binding from her pocket, the strip of cloth that had protected the hidden manumission clause through years of waiting. This came from my granny's freedom quilt, she said, untying the careful stitches. She sewed this clause inside the binding the day she got word that old Mr. Thornton was planning to free us in his will. She unfolded the narrow strip of paper, its edges worn but the writing still clear. The assistant clerk took it and read aloud, Final instruction of William Thornton, witnessed and sealed. Sarah Clark and her sister Ruth, being daughters of Mary Clark, deceased, shall be freed upon my death, together with all other mothers and daughters named in the Bible kept in my desk drawer. This clause supersedes all other arrangements, sealed with the official ring of J. Whitmore, probate clerk, Adams County. The clerk held up the paper to show the black wax seal at the bottom, genuine, old, but clearly authentic. Now, the judge said heavily, let's see this Bible they mention. The assistant clerk produced the small black book, opening it to the pages where names were written in the margins. Mary Clark and daughters Sarah and Ruth, he read. Rebecca Johnson and daughter Anna. Martha Webb and daughters Lucy and Sue. All the names from the fake debt entries, someone in the crowd observed. The judge examined the Bible, comparing the handwriting to other documents. After a long moment, he looked up at Duggan with cold eyes. Appears to me, he said slowly, that you've been running a systematic fraud, creating false debts to prevent manumissions, then splitting the profits with associates who help collect on the fake claims. Duggan's face had gone pale. That's not. Course it is, the little girl said matter-of-factly. Question now is what happens to all the folks who got cheated. The judge stood up on the church steps, his voice carrying across the water to every boat and every face. By the authority vested in me by the state of Mississippi, I hereby declare all documents bearing forged county seals to be null and void. Any debts based on such documents are cancelled. A cheer went up from the crowd, but the judge wasn't finished. Furthermore, I order the immediate arrest of anyone involved in the creation or use of forged official documents. He nodded to the sheriff, who had arrived with the dawn patrol. That includes Mr. Duggan and his associates. As the sheriff moved to make arrests, the little girl tugged on the assistant clerk's sleeve. "There's one more thing," she said quietly. "What's that, child?" She pointed to the newly married couple standing in their semicircle on the church steps. "All them marriages from last night. They legal now?" The assistant clerk looked at his seals and papers, then at the judge. "All properly witnessed and recorded. I'd say they're as legal as any marriages ever performed in this county." Sarah reached for her sister's hand, squeezing tight. "You did it," she whispered. "You set us all free." But the little girl was looking past the celebrations, past the arrests, past the immediate drama of the morning. Her eyes were fixed on something in the distance, more boats approaching through the flood. "What is it?" Sarah asked, following her gaze. "Newspaper folks." "The," little girl said calmly, "word about this is gonna spread past the county. Folks all over gonna hear about forged papers and freedom marriages." She was right. Within hours, reporters from 3 different papers had arrived to document the story. By evening, telegraph operators were tapping out messages to cities up and down the river. The flood that had seemed like a disaster became the backdrop for something much larger, a story of courage and justice that would be told and retold for years to come. But for now, in the immediate aftermath of revelation and arrest, the little girl had one final task. She moved to the makeshift table where all the documents lay spread out in the morning sun. "May I?" she asked the assistant clerk. He nodded, understanding somehow what she meant to do. The little girl untied her ribbon and held it up in the sunlight. The blue had faded over the years, and mud from the night's adventures had stained it brown in places. But it had carried her through everything: the forged papers, the flood, the dangerous crossing, the final confrontation. The assistant clerk cut a small piece from one of the validated documents, just a corner, where his genuine seal had pressed into black wax. He tied this scrap to the little girl's ribbon with a careful knot. "So you'll always have proof," he said softly, "proof of what you accomplished here." The little girl retied the ribbon around her throat, the new addition bright against the faded blue. Around her, the business of freedom continued, papers being signed, marriages being recorded, truth being written down in permanent ink. The sun climbed higher, burning off the last of the storm clouds and beginning the slow process of drawing water back from the flooded land. Life would return to normal eventually, but it would be a different normal one, where certain lies could no longer be told, where certain freedoms could no longer be denied. As the crowd began to disperse, heading home to clean up flood damage and adjust to the new reality, the preacher approached the little girl. "What will you do now?" he asked kindly. "Now that you're legally free?" The little girl considered the question with the seriousness she brought to everything. "Learn to read better," she said finally, "so I can help other folks understand their papers when they need it." She looked around at the scene on the church steps, the assistant clerk still sealing documents, Sarah and the heir planning their future together, the other newly married couples making arrangements for homes and work. "Lots of folks gonna need help understanding what's legal and what ain't," she continued, "what's real and what's false." "Figured I might be useful at that." The preacher smiled. "I think you might be right." The little girl touched her ribbon where the new seal scrap caught the sunlight. "Songs taught me to listen for truth. Papers taught me to look for lies. Between the proms, too, maybe I can help folks find their way." As afternoon settled over the slowly receding flood, lanterns began to appear in windows again, not the emergency lights of the night before, but the ordinary glow of people returning to their homes and their lives. The little girl stood on the church steps one last time, watching the light play across the water. Somewhere in the distance, voices were singing not the urgent freedom songs of the night, but something softer, more peaceful, a hymn of thanksgiving for dangers past and justice served. She hummed along softly, adding her voice to the melody that drifted across the transformed landscape. The ribbon fluttered at her throat, carrying its new burden of proof, its small testimony to the truth that even the deepest flood could not wash away. Tomorrow there would be more work to do, papers to read, seals to verify, truth to be told to those who needed to hear it. But tonight, there was only the sound of voices joined in gratitude, the sight of lanterns burning steady in the darkness, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing that some promises, at least, had been kept. The flood would recede, the papers would dry, the normal world would reassert itself, but the songs would remain, carrying their maps and their mysteries, their hope and their history, ready for the next child, brave enough to listen and wise enough to believe that truth, like water, always finds its way to the light. 5 years later, the little girl, now 15 and no longer quite so little, sat on the porch of the county courthouse, a law book open in her lap and her faded blue ribbon still bright at her throat. The small scrap of official seal had worn smooth with time, but its edges remained sharp enough to catch the afternoon light. Inside the courthouse, another family waited for help with their freedom papers. Outside, Sarah and the heir, their first baby sleeping in Sarah's arms, had stopped by to visit before heading home to the farm that now paid wages to every worker and sent children to the school that met in the old church basement every Sunday. "You happy?" Sarah asked her sister, nodding toward the law book. The girl Ruth was her name, though most folks still called her the little one with the ribbon, looked up from her reading and smiled. "I like knowing things," she said simply. "I like helping folks understand what's real and what ain't." The courthouse clock chimed 4 times, and Ruth closed her book, marking her place with a strip of paper that bore her own careful handwriting notes about seal patterns and document authentication that she shared with clerks and lawyers who'd learned to trust her eye for detail. "Some songs end," she said, standing and brushing dust from her skirt. "But the important ones, they just keep going, verse after verse, helping folks find their way home." She retied her ribbon, tucked her book under her arm, and walked back into the courthouse, where truth was told and justice was written down in permanent ink, one document, one seal, one careful verification at a time.